As I said, we are currently filming and putting together kind of a multimedia type approach to a learning tool, which can as well be used in ordinary cinemas as much as secondary schools, in vocational schools, anywhere where people might have an interest, knowing a little bit more about what is also behind the news that we all too often hear, predominantly these negative news that we hear about conflicts, etc., etc. I think if we can arrive at this age group, as I said earlier on, a 14-year-old, then that's a big aim. And as I said, feedback from people have helped us an awful lot in thinking through these kind of, well, it's a kind of a novel thing. I'm going by some of our interlocutors who are experts in international law and who tell us that, in fact, targeting younger people before they come to universities is a great service to international law, because it does touch us in many ways. Of course, international law is not just what we call international law for the sake of this presentation, but of course there are many international laws that govern our lives in areas that we really never think about it. But that I leave to the teachers of international law. Just to say how I use in different places or fora, as I said, my film, and hopefully soon my films. And that is, I let them speak for themselves, as I do with you at the moment. This is, for me, crucial, is to give space to people to watch something, and then having the opportunity, obviously, to start a debate. I very often, and I'm very lucky in that sense, because I was in the humanitarian field, so I have quite a large network of people who can help me come into debates from very different angles. A year ago, we had an interesting educational approach at a viewing in Geneva, and we had a map maker who came in, who explained the importance of the map that you saw in our film just earlier on, for example, in defining geography. Geography is as contested as international law, as we know, but the great thing about these opportunities, I call them, is that even if we don't have the means always to get a main camera team to work, but we do have everything that we do is documented. And I think what you see today in my presentation is the result of a lot of documentation that may in itself not mean very much at the time of registering, but soon after we realized that for teaching purposes, we have a vast archive already of material, questions, angles that people take in their philosophies, in their ideas, and so on. So this is what I wanted to say to you about education and the film. I hope that I'll meet some of you again somewhere, and we'll have maybe a little bit more time to elaborate on what education can do with film, international law, in this kind of humanitarian setup. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to another person who has been with us for quite a few years now, contributing, always ready to contribute with very deep, meaningful discussions, ideas, and so on. Professor Marcello Cohen, who is an international law expert and also an expert at International Court of Justice, and has worked at the court multiple times. Just to say that I remember the first time I went into Marcello's office. I was a bit, in awe, because I knew his biography, and you never really know whom you're going to meet. You've read a biography; it may not actually turn out to be what you thought you read. But in Marcello's case, I couldn't have, walked into a kinder person's office to find the guy behind the name and behind the title, and helping us establish some of those interviews over the past 2 years or so. And so I really, at this stage, would love to say thank you, and also hand over to him for the next clip. I think enjoy, because it's good stuff, like the others as well. But here it has direct relevance, obviously, to my film, as you will see, but beyond, and certainly for the summit. So I wish you again happy viewing, and I'll talk to you later.
Well, to my knowledge, Broken is the first time in the history of the International Court of Justice in which a judgment of the ICJ or an advisory opinion deserves an entire documentary. So this is very interesting. The United Nations, the ICJ itself, they have produced documentaries about their work, but Broken is the first documentary concerning a specific judgment or advisory opinion of the ICJ. And I was impressed by the clear manner in which the procedure was explained, was shown to the people. This is very important for the public knowledge of the work of the ICJ, because some people, they don't know what the ICJ even is. And Broken gave the possibility to a wide knowledge of the action of the ICJ in general, and the situation of the occupied Palestinian territory in particular. So the reaction of states to the advisory opinion of the ICJ was different, obviously, depending on the general position taken by states with regard to the entire conflict, and also with regard to the role of the ICJ in the conflict, because some states invoke the fact that this is a political conflict and the ICJ should not be involved in what is political. But indeed, this is a very legal question. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not just a bilateral conflict that you have in many regions of the world, a boundary dispute between state A and state B, because it concerns a territory for which the international community has a responsibility. So this was a territory that was under an international regime, the regime of mandates, and it was not for the UK, the mandatory power, to decide, and the matter came to the UN. So there is an international responsibility, and the ICJ did not just recommend states to do that or this. The ICJ ascertained what is the legal obligations of all states, in particular Israel, because it is the occupying power, but all other states have the obligation not to assist Israel in the maintenance of the occupation. And this is a very important point. Then what the international community can do, this of course depends on the political will. And what is important is that to keep in mind that there is an international obligation for the international community to solve the problem. And what I would say is there is a failure of the international community because the international community is not doing enough in order to solve the problem. This is the crucial point. Some people contended that, it was not worth the trouble to go to The Hague to obtain an advisory opinion if after all these years the wall is there, occupation still remains, but this is not true. So even in Israel, the positions taken even by the Israeli Supreme Court and the position taken even by the governments. So at that time in Israel, the predominant view was that there was no occupation. Nowadays, this is a clear idea that there is an occupation regime. Even in Israel, this is accepted. Obviously, you have different positions concerning the idea of annexations of part of the West Bank. But the idea that this is occupied territory is today is a given. So nobody dares challenging this idea that there is a situation of occupation. In today's world, there is the idea that international law doesn't play any role or any important role. It is disregarded by states. Even at the theoretical level, you have some political scientists telling you that international law is just a theory. It's not the international legal system or the set of rules that govern the international community. I would say that the problem is not international law. The problem is compliance with international law. What we are witnessing is a fact that international law is breached quite often, and that in many cases there are no legal consequences. International law are sometimes disregarded by some actors, and the consequence is that in other situations, other actors adopt the same attitude. And this is a very counterproductive situation, and it would be something that many politicians should think about it, because I can give you just one example. So the disregard of international law by the Western states when they decided that Kosovo would be separated from Serbia. So that was in clear breach of international law, in my view. And at that time, Russia in particular, also China, but Russia in particular, strongly condemned the action by NATO and the support for the secessionist movement in Kosovo. And what happened afterwards? So Russia did the same with Crimea against the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and using more or less the same arguments that the Western states used with regard to Kosovo. And in one case you had Russia claiming the respect for the territorial integrity of Serbia, and the Western countries disregarding that. And afterwards, you have the Western countries claiming for the respect of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So this is a telling example, I think, that breaching international law has consequences. If you breach international law today, be careful, because other states can do exactly the same the day after. So the main problem today is not that international law doesn't respond to the needs of the international community of the 21st century. Obviously, you can improve international law in many aspects, but I always tell my students in a rather provocative manner that international law is the most democratic legal regime of the world. Why? Because the paradox is that international law is the legal system that regulates the relation among states, essentially. And as such, is a law without a state. My feeling is that international law is not well known at the public opinion level. So there is no good knowledge of what international law is, how it is produced. So in my view, so you learn international law in some universities if you do legal studies or international relations studies. Otherwise, nobody has learned anything about international law, because at the secondary school level, for instance, in any countries, I believe, you receive some basic information about the constitution of the country, about the law in general, but nothing about international law. My strong advice is always the same. So international law should be at least introduced at the secondary studies level.
Well, thank you, Marcello Cohn, for this contribution. This will not be the last time that people see this, that's for sure, and even more of it. But I'm also very happy, and I have to say again, I feel privileged that I have for, wow, I shouldn't be saying that, but for almost 10 years been working alongside, by now a friend, Christine Leuenberger, Dr. Christine Leuenberger from Cornell University in Upper New York State in the US, whose research, I have to say, has crisscrossed my work so many times that I've given up counting. But each time it is a pleasure, whether we get a chance to see each other in Europe or in the States, also in over the phone and so on. Our discussions are, you could almost see through what we discussed from the very beginning, about starting with the wall, with impacts of the wall, etc. And then becoming much more also philosophical, thinking about concepts, one of which I was very lucky to get introduced to, and that is the concept of the theory or methodology, depending on who you want to listen to, of participative action research. And I think with Christine, we applied that even before I ever knew that such a thing existed. And one of those outcomes of one of those spontaneous kinds of recordings that we did, Christine came to my house here in Geneva, and she spontaneously said yes to me asking her, would you not give us a few ideas about your work of walls and so on. Well, that's a good few years ago. I think we have done this recording way before the film came out. But here she is, giving us some of her really great insights about how walls are a little bit more maybe than simply walls. All right, Christine, thank you again, and let's see your couple of minutes of the interview you had and gave us so kindly. Thank you.
The ICJ basically declared the wall to be illegal under international law, and this is very crucial for Palestinian stakeholders. So, for instance, Palestinian cartographers always draw maps in line with international law, because if they do so, that gives their arguments that they are embedding within their cartographic products a rhetorical appeal, and also it gives it international legitimacy and credibility. So having international law on your side is a very, very powerful rhetorical tool. They're both actually iconic examples of their time. They marked the beginning of a new era. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the beginning of a seemingly borderless and global world which had replaced the politically divided world that we lived in during the Cold War era. The rise of the West Bank Wall in 2002 exemplifies the new age of walls that started in 2001 and exemplified the construction of hard borders across the globe. The West Bank Wall is therefore a particularly evocative example of a global trend. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, people discovered that 28 years of separation had produced what the Germans call die Mauer im Kopf, the mental wall. And it is this sense that the Wessis, the West Germans, were fundamentally different to the Ossis, the East Germans. And the West Bank Wall, according to many psychologists in Israel and the West Bank, argue, has also created this Mauer im Kopf, this mental wall now between Palestinians and Israelis. And this is caused by the fact that now there's virtually no cross-border cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians. On the other hand, policymakers have always maintained that cross-border cooperation is vital towards peace and reconciliation. Also, the wall has caused a lot of mistrust between Israelis and Palestinians. And stories about them over there being different to us over here have become more and more widespread. And also, of course, if you don't see the other, the likelihood that you construct stereotypes about them also increases. And it is important to note, if you look at walls and barriers historically, that policymakers again and historians have pointed out that building walls and fences and barriers might have a range of short-term advantages for the wall-building nation, but they always have detrimental effects on neighborly relations and peace and the potential for reconciliation in the long run.
Okay, I think I said enough about the work we do with Christine and continue to do. So I hope that was also useful to you, especially this idea of the walls in your heads, which when I think about my, almost 10 years working, alongside the development of this wall between Israel and Palestine, I can see there is greater danger in the psychology than actually physically on the ground, of people growing apart, not knowing each other, not knowing what the other is or looks like, etc. So again, that's wonderful to bring this up. With this, we're almost at the end. Just to say that, first of all, it was a great pleasure to be with you. It's a pity we can't be more interactive during these days, but who knows, there may be a follow-up to come in whatever shape, way or form. Just to tell you very briefly again that yes, I am now I'm wearing the hat of the producer of humanitarian and international law, films, documentaries, and so on. I teach with them. I think it's a hugely untapped work, and I'm very much open to work alongside new projects, not just in Cameroon, but elsewhere. I think, and I hope you agree, that what we've done today in the session has a few little eye-openers ready, and if that's what it did, then then I can say that my intervention probably was a success, at least to me. I hope to everybody else as well. So with that, and the idea that, as I said, we are producing educational film material at the moment, and you will see the last clip by Professor Marco Sassoli, who at the time of filming, I'm sure, he was the director of the Geneva Academy for International Law, and I think a great source of inspiration, mainly for me, and I can say that because I see myself very similar in terms of the language that I use, the language of international law that I use, and hopefully creating some meaningful dialogue with. Marco Sassoli uses language that I think anybody can understand. And I found that profoundly important to finish my presentation with somebody who is not afraid to use the language that is kind of on a little bit less polished, but maybe transports certain ideas sometimes a bit more than everything that's kind of ready-made. So with this, I wish you farewell, and I hope that the summit will create impact, and if you feel like seeing more of us, you have the web pages coming up, yeah. So that's it for me, and I want to thank everybody again, and also those people that are coming after me for all the work that goes into a summit of this kind of extents. And well, that's me. I wish you good luck and see you soon. Take care.
I think there are a lot of illusions about international law, because the reality is that, and this is not a new phenomenon, the reality is that there is no rule of law in the international community, and it works in a very different way than domestic law in most countries, hopefully, in the sense that there is no central legislator. States are only bound by rules they have accepted. There is no judge who can judge in a compulsory way disputes. Most disputes are never judged by the International Court of Justice. And even when there's a decision like this advisory opinion, it is often only an advisory opinion which is not binding on the parties. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, there is no police. So even if you get a judgment, there's no one to enforce it. It is a decentralized community, and this is not, I would say, a weakness of international law, but that's the will of states. States want to be sovereign. We are citizens, but we are not sovereign. There is a government, a parliament, tribunals, which even if we don't want, can oblige us to comply with the law. In international law, at least the powerful cannot be obliged. But they should understand that it's in their interest to follow legal rules. And obviously, in this advisory opinion, we deal with international humanitarian law, which is somehow at the vanishing point of international law, because it applies to armed conflicts where the very survival of the state, of a community is in question. So international air traffic law or the law of the sea, naval transportation, maritime law works much better. But I think humanitarian law is the ultimate test, because if international law works, it must also work in these very extreme situations. Now, in recent years, I think we have an additional phenomenon which is very detrimental to international law in general. It is that states are no longer hypocritical. Before, everyone was saying, we comply with the law, but they violate it. But today, they openly say, we don't care about the law. Lip service at least recognizes the rules. While today, and it is not only leaders, it's often also in the population of countries. You don't have only to look at Israel. Look at Switzerland. You know, we had a vote in Switzerland, which fortunately we won, 60% against 40%, but 40% were of the opinion and voted that international law should be below Swiss law. So, and in Switzerland, no one threatens, while in countries which have much higher interests at stake, I'm not sure that it's only the leaders. It's also large parts of the population which say we don't care about international law. But in my view, they're obviously wrong. And here in Geneva, we can refer to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who said that even the most powerful is never powerful enough to prevail always, except if he transforms his power into a right and the obedience into a duty. And the advantage of legal rules is that once I claim the rule is you may not drink my coffee, then it means I may not drink your coffee. And this is today, especially among powerful states, but not only among powerful states, no longer always recognized, in the sense that they say, I'm powerful and therefore I can do that, but I don't accept that you do that. While in international law, in most cases, we don't have a court. And there it would be important that lawyers do not feel themselves like attorneys in a domestic procedure, but advise their government really what is the right solution under international law, because, as I mentioned with a quote from Rousseau, everyone has, in my view, on the long term, an interest that international relations are governed by international law. Small countries anyway, but even powerful countries, because they are never powerful enough to impose themselves all the time. Well, one problem is also the increasing importance of fake news, and that somehow the facts are most of the time controversial. And while we can discuss about the law, we cannot really discuss about the facts except if we have made an inquiry on the ground. And look, for instance, in Syria, the government of Bashar al-Assad says we don't use chemical weapons. It's our enemies who use chemical weapons. And what can I then do as a lawyer? I mean, it would be profoundly unjust to take sanctions against Bashar al-Assad if he doesn't use, but his enemies use. And unfortunately, there are manipulations of the facts to make believe that one party has violated and the other. I mean, for instance, we are all absolutely shocked about the bombing of hospitals. But in some places, the one who controls the hospital precisely wants the hospital to be bombed, because then this is good propaganda in public opinion. And now you can also say there are fake laws or lawfare. which shows the force, nevertheless, of international law, that each party tries to claim that the law is on its side and to interpret the law in a sense that the other one violates international law. And here, I must say, unlike all the preceding issues, the fault is on both sides in the sense that it is also the humanitarians who, for a good cause, but nevertheless manipulate the law by saying everything we don't like from an ethical point of view is a violation of international law. But this weakens international law because, for instance, to take an example, again, in Palestine, the fact that the Israelis arrest someone who tried to make an attack against Israeli soldiers and detain them and try them is not a violation of international law. But Palestinians are convinced that every Palestinian who is detained is a martyr. And you have that everywhere in the world, that people don't understand correctly international law, what is lawful and unlawful, and so they are convinced that everything their enemy does is anyway unlawful, which is not true. I wrote an opinion, an amicus curiae brief to the Israeli High Court of Justice about the illegality of the Bedouin, of moving the Bedouins from around the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And I visited the Bedouins, and the chief of the Bedouins wanted even to give me his daughter to marry my son, because he was convinced that it was thanks to the legal opinion, and the legal opinion alone is totally useless. But there were plenty of diplomats who visited the Bedouin village, and they were all given this opinion. And then they said, look, a professor from Geneva wrote that this is unlawful. Because, you know, with the Bedouins it's complicated because they don't have, but you know that better than I, they often don't have a title to the land. So legally it's a very complicated situation. But there was a good argument, and I made this argument, that as they had the right to use this land under Jordanian law before the occupation, they must be able to continue to use this land during the occupation. So at least this Bedouin chief was convinced that international law helps. This exists in many places in the world where people say in Lviv, Lemberg, in Ukraine, they changed since 1913 6 times nationality and legislation and so on. So, but I mean, this is often Alsace-Lorraine. You have still today some German legislation, for instance, on the relation between the state and the church, and on hunting. This is still, and it was only until 1918 German, but still some legislation comes over. So this is often the case. But obviously what is in the West Bank particular is that there is an occupied territory, and the occupier should respect the domestic law. But in some contexts, it's even more complicated. In my view, for instance, the Western Sahara is an occupied territory. But which is the local law they should respect? Is it the Spanish occupation law because it was a colonial law? Or should you try to find the pre-colonization law? The same problem you had in Eastern Timor, that, let's say, it is very complicated, as you know, to determine the applicable law, and Israel manipulates often the applicable law because they often invoke the Ottoman law and so on. But then the settlements, they don't have to be constructed in conformity with the Ottoman law, because obviously the Ottoman law didn't allow that, and the British plans didn't allow the settlements. While the Palestinian communities, one of the Israeli arguments is to say, we destroy their houses because they don't have a building permit. And we, as an occupying power, we cannot change the British plans. But the British plans were for much less people at the time, obviously. International law is only a framework. It is the domestic law. And even in Switzerland, we have some German influences. The criminal code is, for instance, very different from the French criminal code, but very similar to the German criminal code. And so this is an interesting phenomenon, how domestic laws are influenced by other. Or in Quebec, they have still also, it's under British rule since 1758. They still have le Code Civil and not common law. But it has been very much, it is very much interpreted in a common law way. But you see the difference. When this is a historical phenomenon, then it is somehow like trees, like in the woods. There are some trees who grow up and others are dying, and this is not ideal for insecurity, but this is how history works. While obviously, if you add occupation, this changes somehow the problem. This is lawyers, we train lawyers at the Geneva Academy. They wouldn't have a job if everything was always clear. You have to make arguments. This is why you need lawyers. I tell my students that I'm not like the representative of Mercedes or of Audi who has to tell my car is the best. If I teach international law, I have to tell them how it works. I don't have to tell them it works wonderfully. All on the contrary, I have to explain them also how it doesn't work. Because, yes, I have some colleagues who think like you, to say, I have to sell my students international law and to tell them how wonderful it is. But students are not stupid. They see that it doesn't work in many cases. So I have to explain how it actually works and what you cannot expect. And this could be a starting point, hopefully, for young people to say, we have to change this profoundly. And how you can change this is through the influence on your government. And it means that you have to tell your government you have to comply with international law even if it's not in your interest. Because if you comply with international law only when it's in your interest, then somehow we don't need international law.